Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Soul Driven Podcast. This week, we have such a fun discussion and interview. I am really pumped to jump in. We are welcoming to the show Katie Emma, astrology teacher and the founder of Temple of Cosmic Astrology School. Welcome, Katie.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It's so good to have you here. A little bit of background on Katie. Her and I have been emailing back and forth since I think 2020. I had emailed
Yeah.
her, reached out about her school, and yeah, she's been so kind answering all of my questions and being really patient with me. But she recently did a workshop on midlife transits, and I was like, oh my gosh, we have to have you on the show. We have to talk about this because, of course, if you've been listening to this podcast, you've heard me talk about a lot of the things that I've been going through. And if there's anything that I want to do, it's to help empower others who either haven't hit these transits in their life, who might be in them already, or who might be able to look back at their life and be like, oh, that's what was happening, in this portion of my life. Whatever the case may be, this is such exciting information, and I just can't wait to nerd out on it. So before we dive in, Katie, the question I ask all of my guests: what makes you soul driven?
Ooh, what makes me soul driven? Well, look, I think being an astrologer, I would have to say the language of the cosmos, because for me, it is the foundation of really every aspect of my life, personally and professionally. I think that, with so much emphasis in my 10th house as well in my own natal chart, everything is constantly pushing me forwards towards growth and my evolutionary experience and all that kind of stuff that we're going to tap into today. So yeah, for me it really, maybe it's cliched being an astrologer and saying that, but it really is astrology for me.
I love that. And just for folks who may not know, when you say like the cosmos, like what do you mean specifically?
I mean, the tapestry and the language that is formed between the planets through their alignments. And maybe that sounds a bit woo and out there, but again, that's my language. It's the language that I've learned and that I try to, I guess sort of break down and hopefully simplify, especially like for the average person as well, who's maybe curious about astrology, but it seems a bit too, like where do I begin? But the cosmos from, I think, this astrological perspective is definitely this sort of energy of, or this process of weaving together experience, evolution, perspectives.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I came to astrology. I was actually just telling a friend about this morning. When I was young, I think I was probably 7, and I came across my mother's astrology book, which my mother is like a fundamental Christian and was pretty
Okay.
hardcore growing up. But she had this astrology book, and when I asked her about it, she was just like, yeah, astrology, just kind of, I don't know, acted like it was normal. And of course, myself being a Sag, when I started reading about, the sun signs and these sorts of things, I mean, it was just like I had found some kind of holy grail. I've enjoyed it on and off my entire life. I always come back to astrology.
Yes.
So I love that. I absolutely love that because I think it is, you can look at it in a woo sort of way, but really the way that I look at astrology is that it's a science, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Definitely. Like, look, I'm definitely not a. I don't like to think of myself as a woo astrologer. I really like to, help people, from a much more sort of psychological perspective. And supporting you with your own self-development. That's what I think astrology is a fantastic tool for. Yes, there's woo aspects to it, of course. I'm sure everyone has heard for the last week, everyone talking about like the Jupiter Neptune conjunction. It's probably one of the most woo type of transits you can have, but there's so much more to astrology than another portal or another 11/11 date or all of these kind of things. Astrology is much more complex and vast than those type of pop astrology type of entry points.
Yeah. So you'll have to tell me, because this is just like my own nerdy question, but I have heard so many astrologers talking about how amazing this Neptune Jupiter transit was going to be, and oh, flowy. And I've just been getting my ass kicked. And like a lot of people that I know are in the same boat. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm sinking underwater. What is happening? Why are some of us like experiencing the opposite of that?
I don't think that it's that you're necessarily experiencing the opposite. I think that it's actually you're experiencing the truth of it, because it's not this kind of love and light type of transit that has kind of, I'm sure with the best of intentions of being put out there, but Neptune is illusions, delusion. It can, be related even to our mental health. It's in Pisces. And so astrologically, Neptune has an affinity, or it's ruled in modern astrology by Pisces. In traditional astrology, Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. And that's what made this particular transit so powerful, because both the rulers of Pisces were meeting, and Jupiter and Neptune meet every 13 years, but in each consecutive sign. So the last time that we had them meet together in Pisces was in the middle of the 1800s.
Yeah.
So that's why it's kind of a big deal. But it's not, it's definitely not all love and light. Like I said, it's going to, if Pisces is the last sign, Pisces is transition. Pisces is the end. And so for a lot of us, this is a death of something within ourselves. And to understand what that may be for you, you would look to your own Pisces house. In this example, you would, of course, like if we get super nerdy, you would look for 23 degrees Pisces in your chart. For me, it's my first house. For you, I think it's your fifth house. We'll look at your chart a bit later.
Yeah.
Eighth. So I mean, the eighth house is the house of death and endings and transformations and all that kind of stuff. So I can imagine this has been quite immense for you. And then it's also been squaring your natal Neptune and all the juicy like midlife stuff that we're going to talk about. But for anyone listening, like that has been just feeling pretty off, in April as these transits were exacting, I think that you're feeling right on schedule with what you should be feeling. And it's not pleasant, but it is transitioning you into this new, space, this new, it's like a bridging sort of energy is how I would see it. To me, Pisces is this bridging space. It's the end, but it's also the beginning, this 29-degree Pisces, 0 Aries point. So yeah, I've been feeling it too. It definitely wasn't all rainbows for me, that's for sure.
Yeah, I bet not if it's in your first house. But I love what you shared, because it definitely has been. And when I was recording last week's episode, I think, I can't remember. But I spoke on it a little bit. And yeah, it feels like it's been like I've been going through a death. And everything's been like showing me like, oh, there's rebirth and all of that. And so it's not this overly negative thing, but man, it been painful. Like there have been a couple of days, and it's the type of pain that's not, it's so hard to articulate. You know what I mean? And so, because it's not like overtly, I mean, like there were a couple of things that were overt that happened, or some older things that have been coming up. But overall, it's just been this energy that's been like, what, get off me.
completely, because I feel like, I'm like, was my answer just then even, succinct? Because trying to put it into words is not easy, because it's a feeling, it's a process with Pisces. It's not like a Gemini transit where we can be like really kind of clear and concise around what we're experiencing. It's like with Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces, we are being dragged down into the very depths of ourselves. And so the house that you have this occurring in will show you an area of your life where maybe you feel like you've hit a wall, like where you feel like you cannot keep going the way that you were going on that sort of trajectory. It's the sort of alignment that is rerouting you, but it happens in such a way, like it's so foggy and mystical, which can be beautiful, right? And I think that's where a lot of astrologers talk about, the manifestation and all of these kind of things. And yes, but is your manifestation taking into account, your trauma or the systems that you find yourself in, or all of these types of things? It's not just as simple as wishing for a better life or a better existence. Astrology certainly doesn't work that way.
No, definitely not. And I mean, yeah, I'm grateful for your explanation. I think that Pisces in and of itself is difficult to explain because there is so much that is just, I don't know. And when it comes to Neptune, I like the word murky is what I always think of when I think about
Definitely.
Neptunian energy. It's just murky. You're
Yeah.
wading through, you don't know what you're wading in, you don't know
Yeah.
where you're at, you don't, and that can be like, really beautiful, spiritual, that can, yeah, um, but yeah, this has not been that. So I'm glad to know.
Yeah. And one other thing too, because this sort of ties into what we're going to speak about later, is that we need to remember that Neptune spends 14 years in each sign. And so wherever you have Neptune transiting in your life is really important, because Neptune will not cover every single house of your chart unless you live to be like 148, I think. If you do, good luck to you. For most of us, we experience Neptune moving through, maybe like five houses of our chart, maybe six. And so those houses then are sort of going through their own sort of, I guess we could call it like a spiritual initiation in this life. And so maybe the Neptune transits, for example, that I have are completely different to the ones that you have. We can actually see that, Pisces for you is your 8th house. For me, it's my 1st house. And so neither you or I will ever have the reverse of that, because we're just not going to live long enough, right? So we probably have a lot to teach each other about Neptune, because we're experiencing it from those opposite perspectives. And this murkiness is kind of present in an area of your chart, again, by every 14 years, a change of house. It's kind of like an ongoing murkiness. And so it's not the kind of murkiness that you wake up every day and you go, oh my God, like curse that Neptune in my 2nd house or something like that. But it's kind of like this ongoing, permeating undercurrent of confusion and discomfort, and also really high, beautiful moments of, feeling connected to a greater source through the channel of that house in your chart. But it's a big process, and this Jupiter Neptune conjunction is much bigger than just the few days that we experienced it. It's seeding a whole new cycle for 12 years, and then a whole other cycle on top of that for another 166 years. So it's big stuff.
Yeah, well, it lasts about like a month, right?
Yeah, it's kind of longer, to be honest. Like it's exact for about 2 weeks, but we need to look at orbs to understand, and this is kind of contested between different astrologers, but I think with transits, especially the outer planets, because they're so slow moving, you want to keep the orb to about 2 degrees or less, unless you want to suffer and add a few more years on top of those transits. If you want to, you can. But I usually say that about, these types of transits, Jupiter Neptune, for example, is only for a few months. But if we were talking like, I don't know, if Pluto was coming up to your sun, for example, that's about a 2-year transit of Pluto sitting on your sun. So yeah, these are big process transits when we're talking about the outer planets: Uranus, Neptune, Pluto.
Yeah. Yeah. The big ones are the big ones.
Yes.
Okay. So I love that we dove into that. And I love that you shared. It's really interesting then, because it feels like really we experience Neptune then in only a particular part of our chart.
Yeah,
during our lifetime. And so there's something really important for us to learn in our lifetime from those transits. So I'm going to so have to
definitely.
go geek out on like, yeah,
Yeah,
looking at when it entered different houses, like at what ages I was at, and those sorts of things, and just see if I can connect any dots.
yeah.
I love that. That's really fun.
Well, it's going to keep you busy for a while. Same as Pluto. Neptune and Pluto are the two planets that only move about halfway through our chart throughout our life. So those two planets have such an important role from an evolutionary perspective in your soul's evolution. I guess even from the perspective of like being soul driven, maybe your Neptune and Pluto transits, and then the aspects that those transits make in the rest of your chart are like really key points along the way, along the journey of understanding, maybe to the listeners, like what makes you soul driven. I would definitely look to Neptune and Pluto transits to understand a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so before we dive into transits, I want to lay a little bit of a foundation. First, I would love for you to just share a bit about your background and kind of what brought you to astrology so that folks have a bit of a chance to get to know you a little bit more. And of course,
Yeah, of
we'll
course.
bebop back and forth in that space. But yeah, if you could just share with us a little bit before we get lost in the
Right. I was about
transits.
to say, I'm like, I love that we already just had like a 10-minute like dive into the transits before I've even told anyone like anything about myself. So I have been like yourself, Anna, actually, and what you shared, I was really young when I started to get into astrology. I think I was maybe 9. My mum also had an astrology book. Actually, it was an astrology sex book. So showing
Nice.
the sign of my Pluto in Scorpio generation right there. But I was fascinated. I was like, I'm an Aquarius. Like, this sounds cool. I need to know more about this. And it kind of just set me on this lifelong passion. It was always like my special interest. It's always what I was kind of doing in the background. I started collecting books from about that age. I think every Christmas and birthday, I was always requesting something on astrology. And I was always the kid, probably like most of the listeners or even other speakers that you've had on the podcast before, where the kids with like, all the crystals in our pockets and, dragging our parents into the local new age store and that kind of stuff. Like I always just had such a pull to those experiences. And I have a Pisces ascendant, so Neptune is my chart ruler. So, that murkiness, but also that kind of lightness that can come from Neptune has always been very, very present for me. So yeah, I've been teaching astrology classes now for, gosh, maybe about 10 years I've been teaching. I started my practice of, doing readings and things like that in my early 20s. It's just been my whole life kind of process for me. Like I definitely, I had many years of working corporate, miserable jobs, hated everything that I was doing, and astrology was my constant. And I feel really grateful and blessed that I was able to find a way to make my hobby, I guess, into my life's work. Not everybody has that opportunity to do that, and it's something every day I'm grateful for, that I get to sit down and have these kind of amazing conversations like I am with you, and every week to sit with my students and dive into their charts. I'm like, what is life? What is this Neptunian life that I'm living, right?
That's awesome. It's fascinating to me whenever I meet an Aquarius astrologer, that it's like their lifelong thing, like
Yeah,
they're not like half in ever. It's like they
no.
are core. They have been core since they found it. Like I feel like Aquarius, for whatever reason, and maybe seems to really latch on to astrology. I feel like even more so than any of the other signs. I don't know why that is. That's just my own little nerdy, always paying attention to what people's signs are type
Yeah.
experiment in my head.
Well, I think because we're ruled by Uranus in modern astrology, and Uranus has an affinity with astrology and even, the internet and technology and these kind of things. And so I think for Aquarians, again, I can't speak for all of them. I can speak for myself. Or even, if you have, I would say, an Aquarius rising or moon, like in your big three, that there's just such a natural affinity for astrology, because I think it does bring in that more sort of logical, almost like you said earlier, like scientific, mathematical perspective, that it really sort of fits with how our minds work. It's not too woo. And that's what I love about it. I love that I can just sit down and do all the calculations, and I can track all the planets, and everything just sort of drops into alignment, and it just feels like magic to me. And yeah, like I said, it's been a lifelong passion and hobby.
Yeah, I have the utmost respect for astrology, and I very much view it as a science, as one of those fields that are never be completely understood. Like you'll
Yeah.
never know everything, right? There's always more, always more.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, I'd love to like transition nerd into
Yes.
transits.
Yep.
But again, I kind of want to lay a little bit of foundation here, because I'm not sure how much my listeners are into astrology, or how much, like ultra technical things that they would really understand. So if you could maybe just start off by kind of explaining what transits are.
Yeah. So, to understand what transits are, I think we actually just need to touch on first, like what the birth chart is. And
Okay,
so our
perfect.
natal birth chart is a snapshot of the cosmos, of the skies, at that moment that you took your first breath. And this is why the time in astrology is imperative, because for example, the ascendant shifts degrees every few minutes, and so even a couple of minutes difference in your birth time can actually shift the degrees of your chart. And this becomes really important when we really nerd out into astrology and get into, like, say, progressions, for example. Every minute counts. However, this blueprint, this snapshot of your chart, it is just a moment. There is another breath and another breath again after that. And this shows the constant flow and the movement of the heavens, of the planets. And so it's really important to then understand that the planets are always moving, and that they're always going to be making these aspects back to that moment in time when you were born. And so this is how we start to understand astrology, again, from more like an everyday perspective of, like, what am I feeling today? What bigger cycles am I going through? Again, more evolutionary. So talking about like Neptune and Pluto and sort of being soul driven. And yeah, the transits are, we're able to kind of track them, every moment. They're always changing signs, and each planet spends a different amount of time in all the signs. And that's why astrology becomes quite complicated. And I think people they get curious about it. And then they see, every planet has the different time span, and, there's 12 signs, and then everything becomes times by like 144. And it's just like, it's too much. But people who are super nerdy like that, like me, we sort of take the time to break that down. And again, that's why I love teaching and helping people kind of see that it is much more simple than maybe how it looks on paper. I hope that wasn't too convoluted. That could have been a bit convoluted.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. So just to clarify, the transits are just kind of how the planets are moving across the chart,
Yeah.
and how they
Yeah.
correlate to what planet, where they were located when we were born, correct?
Yeah,
And then how
exactly.
they, like, the relationship between other planets and those sorts of things, right?
Yeah. And that relationship comes through the aspects then.
Yeah.
So, you can't, and I think that this is often a step that people sort of skip when they get into astrology, and especially now because it's so much more popular, and you can just like jump on Instagram or YouTube and find all of these, readings every day and week and things like that. But, it's no good being like, oh, Mars is, on my moon this week, for example, if you don't know what a conjunction means, or if you don't know what a trine is, because the aspect is what defines that transit in alignment with your natal placement. And so, yeah, it's very easy to start talking, all the transits and getting really lost in that. But if you don't understand like what that transit is actually bringing to you, like bringing to the table, you're kind of missing the point. And so it's so important to, I think, to follow, like, again, this is why I love astrology, is because there's a framework, there's steps, there's a foundation that's been built. Like you can't just jump right in. And I mean, you can, but you're not going to be, a very concise or practiced astrologer. And interpretation is everything. If you don't know how to interpret the chart, you're missing the point, and so I think that aspects is really that bridge between the natal and those transits.
So true. I'm glad you shared that. Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into midlife transits.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we were kind of chatting before about how you decided to throw in Jupiter return as kind of like the first one. But yeah, I would love for you to, so Jupiter return, this happens in like mid 30s. And
Yeah.
if you could share with us about that one.
Yeah, sure. So the reason that I wanted to touch on Jupiter transit is because, Jupiter return is because the actual midlife transits that come in our later 30s and early 40s, it's quite an intense period of time. And so I want to sort of show people that between the intensity of like our Saturn return at 29 or 30, when everything kind of, well, falls to shit a little bit. It's one of the biggest initiations that we have into who we are and into adulthood. It's where we really start to take responsibility for ourselves and our life and our choices. And then, you won't really see a lot sort of mentioned. It sort of feels like the 30s is this kind of like barren landscape of like, there's not really these kind of epic kind of transits, but the Jupiter return and the north node, the nodal return, they occur at 36 and 37. They are really important in laying the foundation prior to then some of the more intense transits that we're going to discuss today. So yeah, for those of you listening, if you are around 35 at the moment, you're about to start going through your Jupiter return. Again, a lot of listeners may be looking back and going, oh yeah, that's what happened 10 years ago. And for some of you, it may be really, you might be in your early 20s and it's quite a time away. But I think that what is so brilliant about astrology is that it can just help us see what is coming, not from like trying to predict the future space. I think that's really redundant. But from knowing, for, I don't know, just for having your toolkit, for having everything like, knowing what you're potentially going to be moving through and experiencing, and how you can better navigate that. Like you can't control the experiences or the outcomes of what these transits may bring up for you, but knowing that, I'm going through this at the moment, it kind of helps make sense of things in our lives that often don't make a lot of sense at all. And so that's why I wanted to kind of go back to Jupiter return. And it's a beautiful transit, but it's also one that has a lot of misinformation. So I wanted to also kind of clear that up tonight. But Anna, do you remember yours? Anything that kind of came up with your Jupiter return?
I think that that was actually when I started my second business, which was the business that was, the very first thing that I did that was actually connected to my purpose in this lifetime. It was a retail business. And I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. I worked at it 2 years, and unfortunately, we were just ahead of our time in regards to what we were trying to do. But I was thinking about this earlier in regards to the whole, that the Jupiter return being this time of, like when we've got our mojo, when things are working so well for us, when we've got all of this luck, when things are just really flowing. And the mere fact that I was able to do what I did in that business is just mind blowing to me. I look back at it now and I'm just like, oh my gosh. And how fast things manifested for me in that time of my life It's when I met my partner. So many different things happened. So yeah, it was honestly a really, uh, my Pluto square Pluto actually kind of kicked in, I think, towards the end of that.
Yeah.
But it was a beautiful time of my life. And I have a question. So because I just finished going through my nodal return. I think it ended because the Sagittarius, no, never mind. I'm all mixed up. Okay. How is it that, because I feel like there's this kind of age range, right, for a
Yeah.
lot of these transits. So could it be someone who's even younger than and 35, like, or
Not for
older?
not for the Jupiter return. So
Okay.
that occurs every 12 years. And so I'll just touch on that quickly before we jump onto the next with those timelines. And what I wanted to say with the Jupiter return with what you shared is like it's what you shared is like so on point with like a Jupiter return, it's absolutely this time of a lot of growth and opportunities. But what tends to happen is, again, this sort of like false positivity that is often put into, what I kind of call like cookbook style astrology books. You open up and it says like a sentence or two about, Jupiter in the 12th house or something like this. But the thing is, yes, Jupiter brings us opportunity. He can bring us doorways that are, they're not necessarily open, but they're unlocked. And that's what you need to remember, that not everything is just going to necessarily fall on your lap. And I think that that's where people get disappointed with this transit. And I see it a lot at the moment, because people who have their Jupiter in Pisces, so those that were born, I think around 1986, maybe early 87, they're going through their Jupiter return right now. And I see a lot just like in astrology groups and forums and stuff like that of people saying like, it's been such a terrible time for me. And I think, well, of course, because it's coinciding with this Jupiter conjunct Neptune that we just had. Like, that's not your average Jupiter return. And so when we speak, especially, everything that Anna and I are going to talk about over this hour or so, you need to remember that we're speaking generally and that you have to apply everything to your own chart, because you may not just have your Jupiter in Pisces, for example, like you may have, I don't know, your Mars there, for example. And so you're also experiencing Jupiter conjunct Mars, and that's going to completely change the flavor or the perspective or the experience of that particular return. And so I just kind of wanted to catch that from the beginning, that, it is absolutely these doorways opening. It's why I included it in the midlife transits, because I see it as the beginning point of our really our whole life changing. Because we by our mid-30s, we really sort of step into ourselves, right? We've sort of taken a couple of years to pick up the pieces post Saturn return. We're kind of just like, okay, maybe my life looks completely different now than I thought it would when I was, in college or something. But by the time we get to the Jupiter return, where, like you, Anna, you sort of stepped into this business, this opportunity that came in, and something that you may not necessarily be doing it as much right now, but it's so foundational to what you are doing this minute. And that is the sort of overall gist of the Jupiter return, that it's going to bring you these opportunities that are really laying a foundation for really the next 12 to 15 years of your life.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. And just for anyone who might not know, when we say Jupiter return, we mean Jupiter returning to where it was at when you were born, correct?
Good point. Yes. Definitely good to interject that there. So, each planet, most of the time, each planet, at least up until Saturn, will have a return. And that is exactly like Anna said, that the planet will come back all the way around the zodiac and come back to where it was when you were born. Now, with Uranus, it doesn't actually return until you are 84 years old. It takes 84 years to do one transit. Neptune and Pluto, like I said earlier, will never do a full rotation. So the returns are sort of much more a personal planet sort of thing, rather than a transpersonal or evolutionary transit.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense in regards to Jupiter and the return. So it does lay a foundation then for folks, like with what is coming later with the midlife transits. Is that correct? Like it's kind of like maybe does it set the stage? Does it like tease in or
I think that it's not really in the sense of like setting the stage for those later midlife transits, because the midlife transits are more about how can I put it? Like it takes you a lot, maybe like for example, Pluto, where Pluto is really about like a lot of repressed memories and a lot of your past and things like this that are kind of coming up full circle. A lot of, Pluto can sometimes be some of our traumas, our challenges, and we're sort of having to face them. So it's more about both the North Node return at 37 and the Jupiter return, I think, offer us a peak point in our life that whatever it is that we have been working towards, what we want to, I don't necessarily want to say like achieve, because it's not all about like striving and hustling or any of that kind of stuff. But, it just tends to be a time in one's life that things that you've been working towards tend to come into being at this time, so it's like if you've been wanting to write a book, it's like often for people these kind of things happen. There's sort of like energy of like coming full circle, receiving accolades, like having that next step up, that leg up into your career, or maybe it's more relationship orientated. Again, it really depends on the house that it's in. It's again, it's not it's not always career related. And I think we have a tendency to put a lot of pressure on ourselves. It always has to be something like in a more sort of 10th house space, when we may not be having a 10th house transit. So it's going to have a completely different flavor. So hopefully that makes sense.
yeah, that makes complete sense. Okay, so I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way that I look at the midlife transits kind of overall is that if we're not on our soul path, they're going to put us there. They're going to give us opportunities to connect. Not that everyone takes that, not everyone says yes. But it feels like to me that that's a lot of what they're about, is that kind of reintroduction to what it is that we really want to be doing in this lifetime. But I know that that's kind of a generalization, but do you does that make sense?
It does. And I think, like, yes, it's a generalization, but we're speaking to a lot of people right now. So it has to be
Yeah.
generalized too. But it is definitely a period of time of realignment and adjustment. And there's lots of different transits throughout our life that have these come in. And a lot of them are on a more personal level. I could be going through a particular transit randomly at like excuse me, at age like 25 or something, but you have that same transit and when you're like 35, for example. But the midlife transits are so important because it's something that we all move through at this age. The way that those outer planets attract, it puts us through these initiations, just like the Saturn return happens for all of us at 29 to 30. So do these midlife transits all happen in succession in sort of the last year of our 30s and up to about 35, and all paving the way then for the Chiron return at age 51. But that could be like a whole other podcast on the Chiron return. So I don't want to overwhelm people today, but it's definitely a succession of sort of like you said, Anna, like this sort of paving the way, this opportunity for realignment, reassessment, almost like all the sort of retrograde words that you tend to think of. Yeah. So yeah, it's a big kind of period in time, which is why I think it's so important to know about these transits.
Yeah. Yeah. I wish I had known about them before I was like neck deep.
Right.
I would have had a lot more patience and compassion for myself. Fortunately, like my psychotherapist, also she's like, a dabbling astrologer. And so she was the one who alerted me to, to Pluto sitting on my south node. Okay. So let's dive in. So first one, Pluto squared Pluto. is like a big
Yes.
one. Yes.
This is a big one. And so this one happens because Pluto does not have like I don't know, to explain it the most simply without getting complicated astrology lingo, like it doesn't have like I guess we could say like a straightforward orbit. You know, he spends a different amount of time in different signs. So because of that, depending on what Pluto generation and sign you're part of, the Pluto return can happen anywhere between like, I don't know, like mid 30s up until like your early 60s. And so we've been going through a process where people have been having it much earlier, but now we are in a process of each generation is having it a little bit later. So if you were born in like the 70s and early 80s, you would have your Pluto in Libra. And so you've been going through your Pluto square. I think most people had it at around 38 or 39. Again, you have to look at the degrees in your chart to see when it exacts for you. But yeah, I think for you, Anna, it would have been what, about 30, 39? I think your Pluto's 24 degrees. So Pluto's at 28 now. So this would have happened a few years ago for you. You're definitely well out of Pluto, Pluto square Pluto.
Yeah, it's what I first learned about it was like in 2020, earlier part of 2020.
Yeah, that's when you would have been deep into it, because like the Saturn Pluto conjunction happened at 22 Capricorn. And that's sort of that 2-degree orb that would have been beginning and building for you. That's also your South Node degree, I think. And yeah, so it's sort of wrapping up. It would have been wrapping up around a little bit later into 2020, early 2021, because it had kind of, you know, with the slower moving planets, because of the retrogrades, they spend a lot of time around the same little portion of degrees, you know? So this is why these transits often last for about 2 years, because like Pluto finally hits the degree, for example, of a planet, and then he'll retrograde back over it for another hit, and then he comes forward again. So it's like we always have like 3 hits of Pluto transits, and that's why it's a lot to go through. But yeah, so the Pluto in Libra generation has just gone through this, or will be going through this. If your Pluto is like at 28 or 29 degrees of Libra, you are in the midst of it now. Where for listeners who have Pluto in Scorpio, like part of my generation, we're going to have this a little bit later. So when I did the calculations for myself, I'm born in 88. For me, it won't happen until I'm 41. So it's actually going to happen in the midst of me already having other midlife transits that come at that time. So I'm like, of course it all has to happen. Like there's not even any space for me. I'm like, great, this is going to be a good time.
I don't know. I might kind of want to knock it all out in the span of a couple of years, just nip it in the bud. Because I mean, yeah, versus this like extended,
drawn out process that it can feel like. And you know, I think it's important to sort of, so you know, like what is Pluto square Pluto, because people are probably like, what are they talking about? So Pluto square Pluto is a period of your life where a lot of themes of, you know, personal power, which can come out of course through power struggles, often come up. It's definitely a time of transformation. It is, like I said earlier, I think I brought up repressed memories often come up with this. It'll feel like a, you know, like a button being pushed to the themes of your natal Pluto. So when we have a square, this is why understanding the aspects is so important. You know, a square is a 90-degree angle that is being formed in the chart. And if we think about a square, you know, it's like if we think of the 2 corners that are meeting, you know, they're not opposite each other, so they're not able to find balance, but they're kind of meeting in this uncomfortable, like, you know, it's like pushing and grinding. I always think of a square as like grinding gears a little bit, and sort of being squished and pushed in between them. And that's what makes this transit so challenging, is like, you know, a square is tough at any time, but it's deeply transformative. It's a very dynamic energy. But when it's Pluto and Pluto, we're playing, it's the big guns now, you know, and so it's going to bring up like a lot of your trauma. I mean, trauma, it's such a buzzword that often gets thrown around these days, but it really will bring a lot to the surface around anything that you have repressed. This is even why a lot of times in our late 30s or early 40s, people can suddenly start having like flashbacks to maybe things that happened in their childhood that they kind of repressed and pushed down. You know, some people can have those types of experiences. And so I always say to my clients, my students, if you are coming up to your, you know, your Pluto, square Pluto, work with a psychotherapist. I mean, I say that to anyone at any time anyway, but it's such a great time to, you know, have somebody impartial to be holding space for you. You know, checking in with an astrologer can also be helpful, but remember, an astrologer is not a mental health professional. They can just kind of give you the dates, the times, the outlay, again, can hold space to listen and work with you. But working with a therapist with these midlife transits is so important. And what I love about astrology with therapy is that imagine that you are starting to go through a lot of stuff. You're feeling all of this repressed stuff and maybe childhood stuff, or maybe it's bringing up a lot of family friction and challenges, and it feels like a part of your life is crumbling, collapsing. You know, imagine going to a therapist, but knowing that you're going through this transit. And imagine your natal Pluto is, I don't know, for example, in your 9th house, and transit Pluto is moving through your 12th house. This is going to be stimulating, you know, religion, philosophies, belief systems, as well as your mental health. These types of things. That's very generalized, but imagine being able to go to therapy knowing and being able to pinpoint just a little bit more of what is actually being triggered, you know, instead of sometimes sitting on the couch and being like, well, what am I going to talk about today? Astrology can kind of give you some of the core of what is actually coming up. It takes less time to dig into that with a therapist if you're already aware of like, oh, that's what's going on at this time. And that's something that I think astrology can work beautifully alongside different types of therapy work.
Completely agree. Yes, I was working with a psychotherapist through that time, and I also did about 4 months of hypnotherapy. And my psychotherapist really specialized in inner child work. That was
Yep.
just enormously helpful for me because there
Yep.
was so much coming up around those younger years and around the, you know, needing to reparent, all of those things really coming
Yep.
front and center with the reality of what my childhood was versus what I wanted to believe that it was.
Yeah.
And it was painful. And I second that wholeheartedly, that being able to work with someone who can truly hold space for you in that way, I just think is huge. You know, those are practices that I'll use for the rest of my life that I learned through
Exactly.
that. They're
Yep.
practices I share with clients now. I mean, yeah, that kind of work is work that you'll, you know, as we say on this podcast, when you invest in yourself, the world benefits.
Yes,
um,
exactly.
and everyone, especially my partner, is grateful that I, you
Right.
know, invested in those things.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's such a great time for that because it's a heavy hitting transit. You know, it's definitely one that we feel like, because it's the first midlife transit to come post sort of the high, I guess you could say, of the Jupiter return and also the nodal return, which I didn't touch on, but the nodal return happens at 37. The nodes in astrology are points of destiny, you know, past and future colliding, where you are moving forwards in your life, you know, what you're curious about, maybe what you're a little bit afraid to step into because maybe you're hanging out in your south node a little bit more, which is very normal human behavior to want to be more sort of, you know, safe and in our comfort zones. But we know sometimes we need to have a little push. And so the nodal return is definitely a period of time where everything will just, it feels aligned, you know, it's like, again, it's sort of that same energy I spoke of everything just starts to, you know, not only is the doorway unlocked, but you can move forward through it now. And so the Pluto square Pluto can be really confronting because it's kind of like, I thought I had everything together. I thought I was on top of the world. I thought everything was flowing. I'm doing really well. And then Pluto square Pluto comes along and it's like, hey, how's it going? Come sit on the therapist couch with me and talk this stuff out. Talk all this stuff out that you thought you could kind of just, you know, cruise on past and not confront in this lifetime. And by being able to do this, it is rewarding, but I also just want to say to people, like, you don't have to kind of fake your way through that either. Like, it's not going to feel rewarding during the process, it's going to be hard work. And it's okay to acknowledge the hard work in that. We don't, again, have to always sort of like be like, oh, it's a reward and I'm growing and it's amazing and it's a spiritual experience. It's like, it's all those things, but it sucks, and that's
Sucks
okay.
so hard.
It sucks so hard. And I think just that acknowledgement is so important, because I think that, like, even being able to say that and just kind of laugh and just sort of let it go a little bit, it's like, yeah, it does suck. And you know what? Like, I'm still here, and I'm working through it, and I'm doing what I can. And, like you said, like, your partner is grateful for it. I'm sure every person's partner who is going through same things is grateful for it. And yeah, it's just a very important time of confronting. I think it's overall, I would say it's like a real confronting phase with your psyche. Um, a lot of stuff can come up, and like I said, yes, it can be a lot of traumas from early in life, but we don't want to get too stuck in putting everything into like a trauma basket either. But it's also acknowledging things that maybe we didn't see as traumatic, but now, in our early 40s, we kind of go, damn, that was messed up. I know why that messed me up now, and we can let that go. Pluto is the energy of regeneration. And so in order to, move forward and to grow and evolve from this point on your soul's evolution, it's kind of like everything needs to be released and fertilized in order for you to grow into this new phase. And, you're growing and moving closer towards what I call the crone phase, which I think comes around the Chiron return. And like I said, I didn't want to go too deep into like post 50 tonight. But again, they're all linked. I find it hard to not talk about everything all at once, because you can't talk about one thing in astrology without it linking to something else. But the Pluto square Pluto is such an important stepping stone into maturity. And I think it's spiritual maturity, as well as psychological maturity as well. It's often, it's no surprise that it tends to be a time where even the most resistant to facing themselves or to therapy or anything like that tend to start to actually go to therapy at that time. And yeah, like I said, a psychotherapist will be an absolute godsend during this period.
Yeah, fully agree. I think the word confronting is really descriptive, and certainly was for me, and transformative. I mean, the 2 years that I went through it, my life is completely different now. And I mean, even from when I first started this podcast, I had my marketing agency. That was my primary focus. I'd had that for over a decade, into being a spiritual guide now. And I mean, that was just like, no, I had no idea that I was headed in this direction. But, there were plans laid out for me. And for me anyway, in particular, Pluto wasn't letting me out of it without saying yes, and I could either surrender or I could fight. And I knew that I talk a lot on this podcast about the fated path versus the soul path, and I think in life, when we're all offered these opportunities, if we're not already on our soul path and doing our soul work, then it's like you're going to be invited over to the other path, and quite frankly, you might be booted. You may not have a choice. It just kind of depends on who you are and how much you want to fight. But
and I think it depends too on, like, again, that awareness. I think that, because these transits happen to each of us at these time periods, there is a multitude of ways that they can manifest, right? Because that's going to be dependent on every single thing that you have done prior to that point and choices that you have made along the way. These types of transits will then kind of bring up certain things or sort of exacerbate things, but it's always in alignment with these sort of broader paths that you speak of. But there's a reason these are called the midlife transits, right? Because what do we think of when we think of like a midlife transit? We think usually of like what, a bald dude in a sports car, like with his cap on backwards or something, right? I don't know. I'm trying to think of something like super kind of
With a
cheesy,
19-year-old girlfriend.
right? Exactly. And there's a reason for that, because we're confronted with like our psyche. Hey, hello, face your shit. And most people go, no. And, they kind of regress, and they go back to, their youth in a way, because they're so afraid of facing their growth, because Pluto rules our soul evolution. And so that, if you are not in a space in your life where like you want to face or experience or explore any of those things, and you don't have to, right? Like we're not all on the same, trajectory. Like there's plenty of people that are just, have no interest in all the amazing things that we talk about here on this podcast every week. But that's okay, but these transits will definitely hit differently for everybody, dependent on the awareness they have of themselves as they move through these cycles. And wherever you're at is absolutely where you were supposed to be along this space as well. Like there's nothing that you really have to do or prepare. That's something important too, because we don't want to use astrology to a point that we are then trying to control what happens. That defeats the purpose of a Pluto square Pluto. There's no such thing as control. And like if you were trying to control, like that's sort of what I meant before with the control issues, is that the more that you were trying to control and dictate things, the more you are going to find yourself left behind in life, in whatever capacity. And again, this will be shown for you personally in whatever houses are being activated by this. And so again, that'll be different for all of us. But it's definitely a period of time where I think we tend to, we're either open to the growth and the evolution that comes with stepping into our 40s and beyond, or we're not. And we're going to make choices that maybe feel good or easy or fun, and that's okay too. But there's also consequences for those things, and those consequences, again, all come down to the personal natal chart.
Yeah. So I'd love to move into the Uranus opposing Uranus. Because
Yes.
honestly, like when I think about, so I had gotten a hold of, I think towards the end of my Pluto squared Pluto, I had gotten a hold of Barbara Hand-Cloud's Astrology and the Rise of the Kundalini. And I was just like, holy shit, are you kidding me? Like now I've got this Uranus opposition coming. And I guess like, so this is when Uranus is like on the very opposite side of where it was at when you were born. Just so it's usually throw it easy. But whenever I think of the guy in the Corvette, honestly, I more so think of like the Uranus opposition.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Oh, but I think all of them, and you'll see why they all play into that. But like my first thought is usually Uranus opposite Uranus too, with that particular imagery. And so if Uranus takes 84 years to do one rotation, then at age 42 is, give or take a few months, is when we have this alignment. And so Uranus is the planet of, awakening, rebellion, genius, insights, disruption. It's the disruptor. And so when Uranus is opposing itself, we suddenly feel extremely hemmed in and frustrated by our life if things aren't giving us space to explore life again. This is often a time, if people have had, maybe you had children in your early 20s, this could coincide with maybe your children are just beginning college and you're maybe able to, start to sort of not have to be an everyday constant parent anymore, right? And that's going to completely change your daily life, your routine, all of these things, it doesn't always have to be negative things from these midlife transits either. I think that's something important to touch on here. But the Uranus opposite Uranus is a time where you are going to be seeking, it's kind of like freedom at all costs. And that, again, life will be bringing you opportunity and experience to be thrown into this, whether you want to or not. I kind of think of this transit as like almost like an 18-month to 2-year eclipse kind of vibe. So, it's the sort of thing where like a lot of things can kind of be, come in and come out of your life very quickly. You think you have a grasp on something and then the next moment it's gone. Maybe you thought you were in a happy relationship, but your partner decides that they want to leave, for example, and your whole world is turned upside down. I'm trying to think of really kind of sort of average kind of things that tend to happen at this time. Again, it really depends on what areas of your chart.
Feels like the Uranus opposition in particular, I really see it associated as well as like the second Saturn return, which is a whole different discussion. But like these two big places in life are huge for couples getting divorced. It's just kind of like, and I know like in Barbara's book, she talked about, for women, it's about learning how to use your voice. And for men, it's about learning how to open up your heart,
exactly.
And
I couldn't have put it better myself. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is how we can see we end up being on sometimes in partnerships, with our partner, we can be on different wavelengths completely. If one person needs to open their heart more and someone needs to speak more, but both people aren't willing to do it, or, also in same-sex partnerships, if it's both of your voices need to be opened, but one of you is resistant to that, we're going to be having some issues, right? And so this is definitely like a pot stirring kind of process. But it's one that's extremely liberating. And when you are able to move through that and find that voice or open your heart space, I love the way that Barbara put that, because I think that is really the ultimate test of this. It's like, okay, you've been through the psychological trenches of Pluto square Pluto. You should have been illuminated to some of your stuff. Now, if you haven't, if we keep it on track here with, say, in partnerships, imagine that you haven't done the work at Pluto square Pluto. You've just like kind of repressed. I don't want to face this. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. Uranus opposite Uranus comes along, and that's sort of that example I gave of suddenly, you think that everything's great in your marriage and your partner turns around and they're like, I'm out of here. They find their voice, right? Because maybe you're still not in a space where you're willing to open up to those feelings. And so again, this is why this period of time, like, please work with a therapist, work with a couples therapist. Like, even if you think your relationship is in a great space, there's nothing shameful about having relationship counseling, right? Like, you don't have to wait till things fall to pieces to do that work. And these type of transits definitely stir the pot a lot around these themes, even if you don't have the relationship houses being triggered, just because for a lot of people at that period of time, they tend to be in partnership. Not everybody, and nor do you have to be. A lot of people don't want to be, right? That's exactly why they're leaving relationships at that time, because it's like, okay, I've done the relationship thing. What's next? Again, it all comes down to your own personal trajectory and experience. I think the main thing to take away from Uranus opposite Uranus is that you need to rebel with a cause. That is what is going to give you direction during this process, because you're going to feel rebellious. You're going to want to flip tables and shake things up and, scream and, open that voice. But by being able to channel it into something that actually works with you and not against you, that is how you can really kind of hold yourself through that space. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. I think that's coming up for you soon, I think. Another year or so, I think. You're really in the midst of all of this stuff right now. So
it said in her book, and I mean, I looked back at it twice because I was like, no, it can't be that. It said like 44, 45 for me, but
it can be, yeah. So it's because it's how can I put it? It's not like Uranus spends exactly 84 years to the day. It's like maybe 84 years and 5 days, 10 days, that kind of thing. And so that can kind of adjust things slightly for different people. But yeah, the Uranus opposition I find is normally usually closer to about 44, but we sort of open that space at 42 because of the degree edging closer. And that you start to feel that energy come in before it exacts. You know, we need to always look at transits from this perspective of like, you know, I can't really think of the terminology I want to use right now. Like, I'll just use waxing and waning for this, but there's better words I like to use. But imagine that we have like the transit approaching. You know, that's where the energy is building, right? That we're feeling that squeeze. The actual exact alignment is that release. And then once the planet moves on, within a 2-degree span, we're still feeling it, but it's like that, you know, moving away from type space. And so the time before your transits exact is always the hardest. And so by the time you get to 44, like that should be when you've gotten the memo for what this is, because it all kicked into gear a couple of years before. So like the Saturn return, you know, we don't want to just think that it's, you know, yes, being technical, it will be the exact degree, but there is a process that is felt and that is leading you to that process, sorry, to that way first.
No, that makes complete sense. Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, I mean, the thing is I love that you pointed out, because I definitely don't want folks to freak out listening to
Yeah,
this,
no,
because I'm so thankful for the Pluto squared. You know, I mean, I won't lie, it was painful. It really was. But I did so much healing. And I mean, I'm so much happier on the path that I'm on now. And I would have never even thought that living this type of a life was even possible. So,
yes.
I mean, I'm eternally grateful. And yes, so just wanted to share that in case it's like,
No, and
this
that's
is
so
a lot of
important.
Intensity.
Exactly,
Um,
you know, and
but
I
you
think
know,
that having a conversation like in this format is really great too, because, you know, instead of me being like super technical astrologer about it, you also able to like reflect that feeling back into it and be like, you know, don't freak out. It's okay, you know, and that there is healing from that. I mean, Pluto, like I said, is this energy of regeneration, of healing. And so the reason for it is ultimately to heal. But in order to heal, as cheesy as it sounds, we have to feel. And a lot of us, you know, we grow up in societies and families that there's no space for feeling. God forbid you have a lot of water signs in your chart, right? And growing up in a space that doesn't always feel very accommodating to feeling things. And so a lot of us, like, it's not until we're out on our own or we're in our 30s post our Saturn return that we start to realize like how repressed we have become emotionally, and not through any sort of finger pointing or blaming, but just that it's kind of like this perfect storm and condition that brings this out in human beings, and that often like there's just not that capacity for that healing. And so life will bring you those moments at this time period, and they all kind of cross over and coincide with one another. So yeah, it makes for this sort of very interesting sort of 5-year period.
yeah. So let's dive into the next one. Neptune squared Neptune. So does this one normally come after Uranus
So this is sort of
oppositions,
where,
or?
yeah, so this is where they kind of really cross over each other. So I think that Neptune actually, and don't quote me on this because I'm not actually looking at any of my books and stuff right now, but I think that Neptune may actually start just before, but they pretty much start within, again, about a year or so of each other. And so again, we have a square, right? And so, as I said earlier, with squares, it's this sort of friction, this kind of squeezing process that is happening, and it feels, you know, pretty uncomfortable. And so this is a sort of a transit that is a crisis of faith. And this is where we can really kind of like everything that we spoke of at the beginning of this podcast, actually, to be honest, because we were just speaking so much about Neptune at the beginning. You know, instead of it being a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, it's this square. And so at least with the conjunction that we're having via transit now, like there is a melding or merging happening, which can also feel very overwhelming. It can feel like a big wave coming in. But when it's the square, it's again, there's like this, it's hard to kind of meet in this. There's no middle ground with these types of transits. And so, yeah, it's a crisis of faith. It is a time where we need to really surrender. And to, it's not really like an external world type of transit. It's a very inner world experience. It's one where I would say it's not really about going out into the world and doing. It's much more about sort of sitting back and receiving and surrendering and, allowing yourself to find faith again after maybe your life has been shaken up in some way. Again, please don't feel like this has to be a negative experience, this shaking up, right? Because, some of us, we don't like change. If you have a lot of fixed planets in your chart, you're probably listening to this going like, God forbid I have to change. But we know that the very essence of life is change. That's one of the only kind of constants that we have is change. And so the more you can just kind of remind yourself of that in the midst of these changes and just be like, okay, well, like this or something better, and trust that sometimes you won't see that finish line, but you know that life is pushing you in that direction. That's kind of like what the Neptune square Neptune rounds off this kind of time with, where it's like after maybe a lot of kind of chaotic sort of change or uncertainty, should I, shouldn't I, a lot of that type of questioning, suddenly we kind of come into this voidal space. And it's so important to allow yourself to just be in that space, because so much is then kind of, how can I put it? It's like things are happening behind the scenes, not in a way to disempower you. We always have that choice to step up and make decisions in our life. But you know how sometimes there are just those kind of phases where it's like, yeah, we can't quite see everything that's coming together, but we know that it is, and somehow against all the odds, it does. That's kind of what this transit is also like. Now, it can be a very escapist type of transit. So this is why I also think like this is definitely the guy in the sports car, right? He's kind of lost in the fantasy of the younger girlfriend or whatever. There's
How long
probably
does this one last?
It's going to be about the same. These are all about up to 2 years. So again, you can see here that if some are sort of starting at like 41, 42, they're ending at 44, 45, you're kind of coming out of one just as another one is starting to build. So I think that, it's so important to look at all three of these sort of consecutively, but also coinciding with each other, because you start to see how they have like, in a way, repeated themes. And so that you can't have one, without the other, and that they all are, again, these sort of building, stepping stones, building stones, I was going to say, these stepping stones to what would be the Chiron return. Now, there's also another Jupiter return at 48. And it's what I taught about in the webinar that I did, which is like, after all of this kind of chaos, after all of this sort of like rearrangement that goes on in our early 40s, this Jupiter return comes again and sort of offers us this blessing, this doorway, this opportunity. And so, don't feel like, that nothing is going to, that things are going to sort of stay the way they are during that process, because things, like I said, will always change. There is always growth and evolution. And the more you resist those changes, the harder the process will be. And again, that's why working with like a therapist or, checking in with an astrologer who can just help you kind of on a personal level unpack, how this is affecting you more, by, again, the houses, the other aspects in your chart, can be really, really supportive during these periods, because like I said, change is the only guarantee that you're going to have at this time in your life.
Yeah. I'm in the Neptune, squared Neptune right now. And when you said escapism, like I have caught myself tuning out more over the past, I don't know, 6 months, maybe a year.
Yeah.
More than I ever have in my whole life. And at first I thought, because we were still like kind of in the midst of the pandemic. And so I was like, oh, this is like maybe the pandemic happening.
Mhm.
like I've never been a big, like had interest in TV, or, and I've always been really pretty disciplined about my cell phone and the amount of time I spend on it.
Yeah.
And I've gone through these periods where it's just like, I can't put it down. I can't get
Yeah.
away from it. I can't. And I'm like watching these shows, and I'm just like, what is going on? Like, I've never been this way before.
And
It's been wild to experience that in myself when, like, I've literally never been that person.
yeah. But I think that, there can also be like a healthy dose of escapism too.
For
And I think
sure.
this is where we need to be conscious of, yeah, like, there's a difference between like just watching a few shows and getting lost in that to, full blown delusions that can crop up during this period in some capacity. So, I think that, being mindful of when we're starting to kind of be too out of our body is really important. So, any type of like body-based body work type of therapy can be so important. Even just like being on a massage table at this time and allowing yourself to receive and come back into your body, because there can be such a tendency during any type of Neptune transits to just check out. Like, and that's also okay. We don't have to be hard on ourselves for that, but we need to acknowledge, like, okay, I still have my meat suit. I'm still alive at this point in time. I have to be here and present on earth in this time and space. And I'm here for a reason, like, as much as it's beautiful to move into the upper chakras and to meditate and to have our spiritual practices, they have to be supporting us in real time here. And so this is a period of time where we can sort of teeter on the edge of like, are my spiritual practices, only serving me, or is there a way that I can help, channel them through me to serve many? And I think that that's kind of a more existential thing that crops up with Neptune square Neptune as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I've talked about, this on the podcast for sure. I think that it's okay to tune out. For me, it was definitely when I was catching myself doing that versus when I caught myself tuning out in a way that wasn't in my best. You know what I mean? Like going to an extreme. And part of part of what I put into place for myself was I decided to challenge myself to do yoga 365 days of 2022 because I'm like hell bent on just stepping more into my embodiment, and
Yeah,
it's just, I mean, my goal is at least 15 minutes a day, so it's doable. But yeah, it's amazing to me when I come back to that sort of a practice. And I think that that's certainly one big lesson that I've been learning, is just how crucial our like everyday 3D activities really assist us in
yeah,
actually being able to step into our purpose, and what a
absolutely.
supportive role that they play for that. Um, so yeah, I'm all for, hey, like go watch a show. You had a bad day, like do that for yourself. But I was definitely catching myself just you know, mindlessly just out of control,
Oh, I get
in
it.
ways
Look,
that I
like,
hadn't been before. It's just been really surreal for me because again, that's
yeah,
like not something I've ever been in.
yeah, it can
So
be, yeah, it can be, I don't know. See, it's funny because like I said, like I'm a Pisces rising. So love a good checkout on occasion. Um, but I know for me that that's really restorative. And so I think that maybe if you can also look at it from that perspective of like, you were doing this not necessarily as a symptom of like checking out, but of allowing yourself to restore yourself and to rest. I think that Neptune square Neptune really brings in a period that allows us to connect with ourselves on such a deeper level and to really heal and restore, like post the chaos of Uranus opposite Uranus, and some of the heavier hitting stuff that can come up through Pluto square Pluto. I think that it can sort of Neptune square Neptune can be like a bit of a reprieve, but it's just being conscious of like, okay, am I actually allowing myself to heal and restore myself, or am I just checking out, you know? And that's something that we all have to question really at any given time anyway. Um, and something probably in the last week that we've all had to really confront with this Jupiter Neptune conjunction. I mean, it was right on my North Node. So I'm just like, okay, this is part of my destiny, but I'm just like, I'm just in bed and I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm just going to keep watching my shows, and that's okay. That's my life today. And there's no problem with that, you know,
Yeah.
just not every day.
Yeah. No, I love that. Okay, perfect. So wrapping up here, I would love for you to share with us, some ways in which people can work with you. Um, Clearly you're a teacher.
Yes.
So yeah, how can people, is this workshop accessible to folks if they want to follow up and take the course again, or what would you suggest there as well?
Yeah, so look, like I taught it as a live, kind of like a live class. It's not currently up on my site, but I would be happy to link it to anybody who is interested. I am also contemplating, I put together like a workbook for it, and I have been thinking of just making that available for just a couple of euros on my website. Um, but one of the best ways I would say to work through this stuff is to maybe have a reading, and that can really help you unpack, like, in alignment with your own life's journey, in being able to share some of your story and being able to unpack together how these transits are actually playing out for you at this time. And again, that can also be done through my website. And I teach courses as well. So my school year starts every October. And if you really kind of want to get to, really understanding astrology, if you are a therapist or something yourself, I always say astrology is like such a great tool to have alongside other types of therapies. I love to teach students who are also in their own space working as, coaches, teachers, or therapists. So yeah, I teach 2 levels, beginners and intermediate. So I would love to connect with you if you want to learn more about astrology. It's absolutely what I love doing, is teaching. So yeah.
Yeah. And then the school that, like, the monthly.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. So yeah, so I also have a monthly community school as well. So that is for more casual students. If you are just kind of wanting to dip your toes into astrology, you're also looking for community just to hang out with other people who are interested in astrology. I have a pay by the month school that you can also sign up to. For students who then come along and do like the full-time courses with me, you get access to that monthly school as part of your curriculum. And in that space, I just teach a different astrology sort of topic every month. We open up a lot of conversation around the different topics we pick. My students get to vote every month on what they want to learn about. So it's kind of really fun that you sort of you can interact and sort of have a say in your education as well. I think that's really important. And yeah, it's kind of just a place to hang out and make friends as well.
And there's like learning modules within that school as well, correct?
Yeah. So it, you can actually go back and access everything that I've taught beforehand. And there's weekly chart interpretation. There's all kinds of stuff really. And then the more module based is the annual programs that I do. So that's where we actually meet every single week for about, I think it's 9 or 10 months is my school year. Usually like October to July we meet. And that's where we go really deep. That's where we sort of explore things on a more module type of basis.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. All right, Katie, are you ready for the lightning round?
I am ready. Like I said to you, though, it's currently like, what time is it? It's like quarter to
I
10 p.m.
know.
for me. So I'm like, I've got my bed brain on a little bit, but I'm
You'll
ready.
be good. I would be asleep by now, like straight
Yeah.
up. Okay. So first question, what is the one habit that you can't live without?
Oh, honestly, it's my morning coffee. Like, it is my everything. Like, I have my moon in my 6th house. So routine and ritual is so important to me. And like that first coffee in my big mug, sitting on my bed and just playing my little decorating game app. Like I like to decorate little rooms. I'm such a grandma. That is like my, that is my morning every day. That is my love.
I love it. I love it. Okay. Number 2, what does spirituality mean for you?
Spirituality for me is a process of reconnection. I think, it is a pathway and tools that are helping me remember what I already know. And it's like this, I don't know, I just love that sort of those aha moments that you have of like, I get it, but I know it. It's all coming back to me. Like that's what kind of sparks my joy within the broader sort of spiritual realm and perspective.
Awesome. Okay. Number 3, what is your advice to anyone who's looking to find purpose?
Um, my advice around purpose is that learn or come to a point of understanding that purpose like actually has nothing to do with hustle culture. And the sooner that you can realize that your purpose does not have to fall within like a capitalistic kind of space, the more content I think you will actually feel. And I would also recommend to learn your astrology chart and come and look at where your purpose is hiding within your own blueprint.
Is there like a quick answer to where that might be?
Absolutely. So the midheaven in our chart, so that's a point that separates our 9th and our 10th house. That sort of defines our public image, our legacy, for lack of another word, our purpose. Now, it doesn't necessarily define it, but it can show us what lights us up in that capacity. And it may not necessarily be career orientated like we've kind of conditioned ourselves to think that it is.
Interesting. Oh man, I have so many midheaven questions. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be
We can do
good.
like a midheaven workshop or something like
Gosh,
that.
seriously though, because mine just doesn't. Anyway, what I've heard about it, I'm like, no. Okay, so last question. It's really, really huge. Are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready. Like, yep.
Where can people connect with you online?
People can find me at templeofcosmicastrology.com and the same. Oh, wait, do you mean find me online in that capacity or like?
All of it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
all of it. So I was just like, see, my bed brain.
You're good. You're good.
And also on Instagram at the same name. So Temple of Cosmic Astrology.
Perfect. Okay. And of course, folks, we will link out everything so you can find her very easily. Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing
Thank
your
you so
time
much.
and
It's been
wisdom.
such a pleasure. Like I said, it's definitely getting to the later end of my evening. So I hope that, for everyone listening, that I've been clear and concise and that I haven't sort of gotten too lost in the astro lingo or anything like that. And hopefully you have some insights into, this deeply transformative time. And one that I think that, once you come through the end of it, you will sort of realize like that it's one of the greatest sort of periods of your life. It can offer you so much, but you have to be willing to, face yourself and do that work. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always said, even when I was younger, like 40 is just getting started. And it's so
Yeah.
wild to me that like that's literally how it feels now that I'm
Mhm.
here. I'm just like,
Yep.
all right.
Yeah.
And just, a reminder to folks, definitely will get that link for them to check out your workshop because this is dense material and covering it in such a short amount of
Yeah.
time. Like there's so much more here
There
to
is.
dive
Yeah.
into.
I think we spent
So
2 hours together when I did the workshop, and I still felt like I barely covered everything. So
yeah. Yeah. Well, there's
yeah,
like whole books written on, like chapters written on these different ones. There's a
completely.
lot.
Completely. So yeah, again, that's why I really just want to reiterate to people that, it's such a vast topic that I can't even really begin to go to, the depths of what this can actually bring to you. And so I really just want to make sure that I'm not leaving anybody hanging in this space of like worry or fear about this period of time, and to really look at it as like one of the most exciting, sort of expansive periods that you'll enter into. And like Anna said, like I think that life just sort of starts to get started in our 40s. You know, it's something I'm actually looking forward to. So yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, you did a wonderful job. So thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right, folks, if you were inspired by today's interview, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify. Make sure you subscribe. Be sure to sign up for the email list to receive podcast updates, helpful resources, all the things. And don't forget, when we invest in ourselves, the world benefits. Until next week.